Good morning, Peter Goertz. I'm a psychiatrist. Difficult decisions as a doctor. Wow, that can be a real challenge. My wife and I last night were watching the TV series 5 Days at Memorial, and there was a decision a doctor had to make. It was about Hurricane Katrina. Actually, that hospital is quite close to where I live here in New Orleans. And the decision a doctor in that series had to make was to evacuate a patient. And this was after 5 days of being in the hospital, very little resources, flooding in the community right after the hurricane. So very difficult situation. And the doctor had not been sleeping hardly. So very difficult situation. So one option would have been to try and evacuate a particular patient or patients. However, that would have been extremely difficult because there were very limited resources. Another option would have been to just abandon the patient because all the staff at that point had to leave the hospital and all the patients who could leave had to leave. So abandoning the patient would have been an option, but that would have been abandoning the patient to die. Then another option would have been to stay and die with the patient, which also is a very challenging option. And another option was to euthanize the patients who could not leave. So very difficult options to choose between, and also in a very difficult situation right after a hurricane with then major flooding. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Hurricane Katrina. The hurricane was bad, but the flooding was terrible after the hurricane. It began after the hurricane, the flooding, because of a levee break. And so that was a doctor being between a rock and a hard place, and that can happen in life in general. Life can be very difficult, and that is something for us to try our best to accept, because interestingly, in my opinion, if we accept that life and decisions in life can be very difficult, then for some reason, life becomes easier once we accept that it's difficult. So, and this what I'm talking about doesn't pertain necessarily only to medicine. I remember a veteran when I was working at the VA hospital was telling me he was ordered to shoot and kill a wounded enemy soldier. And that was a very difficult situation for him because he had just arrived in Vietnam, and he was ordered to kill the enemy soldier, and the only other option he really had, apparently, was to disobey orders. So, and the wounded enemy soldier was not in any way threatening. On the contrary, it was a gentleman who was begging for help and desperate, of course. So that was, for that veteran, a very difficult decision, and many years later he was still struggling with that. Another basic decision any of us could be confronted with is, knock on wood, God forbid, your house is on fire, your dog is in the house, you've had the dog with you since it was very young, and you've had the dog for many years. The dog would very likely put its life on the line for you. The house is burning in a major way. The dog's inside. Are you going to go inside and try and save the dog with the risk of both you and the dog getting caught up in flames and dying, and then you not being available to your family, your children, your wife? Are you going to risk that? Or are you just going to let go and say, I'm going to let the dog die in flames, and the dog very likely would risk its life for you? So any of us can be confronted with a situation like that, which of course is a very difficult situation to be in. Now, a medical decision, for example, one medical decision, for example, would be, let's say you're in the emergency room working as a doctor, as a psychiatrist or ER doctor, and you're confronted with a suicidal patient, which can be a gray area. The patient doesn't want to be admitted, was traumatized in a hospital maybe before, and on any hospital ward, traumatic experiences can happen. You have very troubled patients, possibly violent patients. So do you force that patient to be in the hospital with possible trauma then to the patient emotionally from being admitted? Or do you not admit the patient with the possible risk of the patient actually killing themselves? So very difficult situation. And it's, again, being between a rock and a hard place and doing the best you can. Another example and the example I just gave is a pretty common example where you just have to weigh as best you can and do the best you can. Another example that happened in my career was because of a mistake, and this was quite a few years ago. There were only paper charts, and because of a clerical error, the patients were getting each other's medicines. So each patient was getting someone else's medicine because of a clerical error. A really bad situation, of course. And then the patients noticed that because they weren't being given the medicines that they were used to getting, and they could recognize that with the pills and capsules. So one of my patients, he was quite an angry gentleman and quite caustic, very angry at staff. He was, of course, one of the patients who was affected. He got the wrong medicines. He noticed it. He was offered the wrong medicines, noticed that though, and did not take those medicines. So a very wise choice. So what do you do as a doctor in that type of situation, or as a psychiatrist in that type of situation? Do you just go ahead and tell the patient the truth? I'm sorry, this was an error. And then the patient may take you to court, sue you, or sue the hospital at least. And another option would be just to not acknowledge that there was a mistake to the patient and try and save yourself. But then, of course, the next day, you have to look at yourself in the mirror, which can be then quite uncomfortable. So what actually happened in that scenario was I just went ahead and told the patient, truthfully, this is what happened by mistake. Patients were getting each other's medicines. And I was surprised, actually, with that particular patient. Once I told him that, he just accepted that, and the issue was done. That was it. So I was surprised, and it worked out very well. I mean, of course, that aspect worked out very well. The fact that they got each other's medicines was not a good thing, of course. Another example is, and this happened to me, if your supervising doctor tells you to do something to a patient that you feel is unethical, you have, again, the rock in the hard place. Do you do something unethical that you think is unethical to a patient, or do you lose your job? Neither one is a very comfortable choice. So in that situation, actually, and I feel bad about it to this day, in that situation, I did not do what the supervisor wanted us to do, but other people did. So the patient actually had what the supervisor recommended or advised done to her, and I feel bad about it to this day. So what I'm talking about are really difficult decisions, there's difficulty in balancing different aspects of those decisions, and protocols will not necessarily help. Protocols can help in a general way with decision making, But in a specific decision, like that decision that I mentioned in the TV series 5 Days Memorial, in a specific situation and with a specific decision, a protocol will not necessarily help. So what I try to do for myself with decisions in general and specifically with very difficult decisions is get as many facts as I can, as I feel I need to know, really know as much as possible about a given situation, then try my best to relax, not think, and just go with what feels right ultimately to me. Of course, that's easy to say, especially again, going back to that series 5 Days at Memorial. If you barely slept for 5 days or 4 days and then are expected to make very serious decisions, are you going to be able to relax? Again, it's easy to say. Thank you very much.